He is a soldier, psychiatrist, and writer who realizes early on how he is being turned into a black man by the white, and in his short lifespan gives the oppressed a philosophy that would inspire Sartre, the Black Panthers, and the anti-colonial movements around the world. Today, your History Fox introduces you to the story of Frantz Fanon, whose theses around racism and the exploitation of black people are more relevant today than ever. He was born in 1925 on the Caribbean island of Martinique, then still a French colony. His father regularly reminded him that the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, long applied only to the white French. His teacher here was none other than Aimé Césaire, who is considered one of the most important voices against the injustices of colonialism and had a lasting influence on Fanon. Frantz considers himself French and is only confronted with his otherness when white French soldiers of the Vichy regime arrive on the island. The idea that one is not only human but instead constructed as a black through the gaze of white becomes painfully clear to him here. But as a patriot, he decides to go to the war together alongside de Gaulle's Free French forces against Nazi Germany and goes to Europe. Here in Europe, the omnipresent racism hits him like a punch. People are divided into classes, with the first class reserved for the white Christian French. The black soldiers are sorted out just before the march into Paris on the justification that France should not be liberated by black people. Now that the war was over, Fanon decided to study medicine and philosophy in Lyon. He wrote down his observations on racism and published his book Black Skin, White Masks at the age of only 25. He studied the classical authors of psychoanalysis such as Freud, Jung, and Adler, was strongly influenced by Sartre, and studied the German philosophers Nietzsche, Hegel, and Jaspers. Especially Hegel's thesis that Africa was a continent without history was often reproduced in Europe and served as a basis for the white exploiters to dehumanize Africa and its people. Of course, this was very convenient for capitalism, because as a cruel consequence, people here could be made into things god and prey, and the thing can be used and sold without moral objection. Fanon's fight against racism takes a deep psychological approach. He is interested in both sides, victims as well as aggressors. Violence, he believes, deformed both the colonizer and the colonized. In his first work, Fanon dives deep into the psyche of black people, who are denied recognition by whites as equal beings. Everything that happens to black people is related to their skin color. Fanon declared war on every form of racism, even with weapons if necessary. His conviction, whoever reduces the other to the color of their skin dehumanizes them. Among civilized people, there can be no reasonable argument for denying the other person his or her humanity. This is not negotiable. Accordingly, the civilized nature of whites is a lie. After graduating, Fanon took a leading post as a psychiatrist in a clinic in the north of French Algeria, in the town of Blida. After his experiences of racism, he has long since turned his back on Europe and no longer sees himself as French. Seeing that the oppressed in Algeria are now demanding their independence, he joins them. Paris takes brutal action against the resistance fighters, and both they and the French soldiers end up in Fanon's clinic. Here he treats both the injured Algerian fighters and the French torturers in equal measure. He wants to help both sides. At the same time, he also fights against the backwardness of the psychiatric system in Algeria. He wants to implement new therapy options in which doctor and patient face each other as equals, and locals are not, as it has been the case up to now, regarded as immature creatures who are simply locked away in case of mental illness. For the psychiatrist Fanon, racism is a mental disease, but not exclusively so. It is also a societal disease. Therefore, its cure cannot be individual but collective. Society must immunize itself against the virus of racist structures, but at the same time, the individual must also free his mind from deformities. Racism must therefore be attacked both in society and in each individual. The Algerian Liberation Movement, FLN, makes Fanon its voice. Later, as a representative of the provisional government of Algeria, he visited Ghana, Liberia, and Senegal, among other countries. He hoped for a pan-African strategy and genuine independence for all African states. But how can the oppressed people defend themselves against a superior power and an entire dehumanizing system? Which tools are legitimate? Why is the means of violence reserved for the oppressors only because they say they will bring civilization to the savages? Doesn't the enslaved even have to kill the slave master if he wants to be master of his own life? Or as Sartre so drastically put it, to shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone, doing away with oppressor and oppressed at the same time. These words can be found in Fanon's last and most famous work, The Wretched of the Earth. Violence would thus also have a liberating dimension. Violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from its inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. Fanon was often accused of glorifying violence, but he never justified violence as pure arbitrariness. He was, however, against denying the oppressed right to resist with weapons, and to justify this by referring to the human rights of the oppressors. Fanon would probably have disagreed with all those who, in the name of humanity, call on the victims to renounce violence when resisting. Indeed, the idea of human rights is one that Europeans have now consistently violated and continue to violate, even after the United Nations Declaration on the subject. Leave this Europe where they are never done talking of men, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe. For centuries, they have stifled almost the whole of humanity in the name of a so-called spiritual experience. The wretched of the earth becomes his legacy. Fanon was diagnosed with leukemia and dictated the work to his wife Josie in the last 10 weeks he had to live. 3 days after its publication, Frantz Fanon dies at the age of only 36. Fanon's words are still highly significant today. In many African countries, the legacy of racism continues to have an impact, and the fact that a large part of humanity is cut off from most necessities and continues to be marginalized or exploited is very much relevant. And if we are honest, the number of the wretched of this earth is not decreasing but increasing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in more fascinating but overlooked personalities, click here.